Good morning, church. It's good to be with you. It's good to be with the praise team and all those others who are here this morning. I just can't wait until we're all together as a whole church. It's been hard just worshiping alone online, and it's just good to be in this room. The last several months have given me racial whiplash. The murder of George Floyd was devastating to witness, and there's been so much discussion about anti-black racism over the last couple of months. As Coach mentioned several weeks ago, about 2/3 of the most purchased books on Amazon.com have to do with race. Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility, and other books like that. People have taken to the streets all around the country, not just in major cities with big minority populations, but even in smaller towns or suburbs that don't have that much of a minority population at all, that are dominantly white. We're seeing Confederate statues and symbols come down. Institutions are changing the names of their buildings. Mayor Lightfoot took down 2 statues of Christopher Columbus because it represented colonialism. And even the state of Mississippi has agreed to take the Confederate flag symbol off their state flag. In Mississippi, this is a Republican governor who is approving this. There's a lot going on. For Jeanette and me, though, there's also another dynamic. There's another racial dynamic. As some of you may be aware, incidents of anti-Asian racism have also been spiking during this time because of the coronavirus, which started in China. Donald Trump has exacerbated this racial tension by calling COVID-19 the Chinese virus, or calling it the Kung flu, which is sort of an insult I could picture folks saying to me when I was in the 3rd grade. I mean, I just picture that's the kind of stuff that people would say to me as an Asian. There's been some extreme incidents. In Texas, outside of Sam's Club, there was a man who attacked somebody from Burma, a man from Burma, and his 2 children who are 2 years old and 6 years old, and stabbed them, trying to kill them, because he thought they were Chinese and were spreading the coronavirus. He stabbed children in the face. 2 years old, 6 years old, and they weren't even from China. They're from Burma. It's a different country. It's like stabbing a French person because you think they're German or something like this. There was an Asian American woman in Brooklyn who left her home at 11 o'clock at night just to take out the garbage, and somebody was waiting for her and threw acid in her face. This was caught on videotape. It was premeditated. He was just sitting there, and he threw acid on her face, again, out of anti-Asian racism. We've had some personal experiences with this as well. Just when the coronavirus was starting, before we even did shelter in place, when you could still go out, Jeanette was on the train and some random stranger just said, "Hey, coronavirus." My parents have noticed that their neighbors are giving them funny looks, and my mother had an incident at a store where somebody screamed at her and said, "I hate you people, get out of this country." And I could tell you many other stories of friends and family members and so forth who are in other areas who have had similar kinds of experiences, not necessarily violent, but you just start to get your guard up and feel like this is not a friendly, warm place. And a lot of these things have happened in places that claim to be very progressive or open-minded or liberal. They're just as racist as everywhere else. Let's not get deceived. One of the things that is different about the Asian American and Black American experience is that Asians' experience in this country is more recent. There have been Asians here since the 1800s, but most of us came after 1965. There was a major Immigration Act in 1965 that was actually a result of the Civil Rights Movement, where Lyndon B. Johnson couldn't say that this is a progressive country on race when it had racist policies with regard to immigration. So as the Civil Rights Movement was happening, in 1965, he issued this major Immigration and Nationality Act that allowed many people from Asia to come over who were barred from this country for the previous several decades. That's why we weren't allowed in this country. That's why we couldn't immigrate. Even though many of our home countries were very poor, they were suffering under colonialism, they were going through economic struggle, they were going through war. My grandmother moved over, the immigration law happened in 1965. My grandmother moved over in 1967. My parents came over in 1970 when my mom finished college. My dad was a few years older. They got married here with my grandma so that she could be with my mom. That's my story. Our parents, my generation of Asians' parents, didn't know anything about U.S. race relations when they came to this country. They thought it was just the land of opportunity, place where you could live out the American dream, They're living in a post-war country after the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, so they're just escaping economic devastation. They came over here, they're like, this is a land of opportunity. And they knew there weren't that many Asians here, so they said, people might not treat you well, but they don't mean badly, it's just because they don't know us. So just keep your head down, work hard at school, get a good job, get good grades, and then eventually Americans will come to accept you. But as my generation has grown up, born and raised in this country, we're starting to realize this is not the case. We're starting to realize that anti-Asian racism is actually very closely related to anti-black racism. Both of these are tools that are meant to keep elite whites at the top and to keep all persons of color beneath them. And one of the strategies of elite white supremacy has been to pit minority groups against each other and also against working class whites so that the elite whites can just get off scot-free and continue to enjoy their homes, continue to enjoy their schools, continue to enjoy their high-paying jobs, and then we're down here fighting with each other and they're getting off scot-free. And we're doing this without realizing that the game is actually rigged against us. We're competing for resources down here, while the game is actually rigged in favor of elite whites in the first place. For Asian Americans like myself, it does not matter that we are born and raised in this country. It does not matter that we speak native English. It does not matter that we are U.S. citizens. When we look different, people think we don't belong here. So if something goes wrong with a country in Asia, even if we have nothing to do with it, the first response is to blame us and tell us to go back to where you came from. Well, I don't have another country to go to. This is where I was born and raised. This is my citizenship. I'm not a Korean citizen. I don't speak Korean well. If I were to go to Korea, I wouldn't know how to get insurance. I wouldn't know how to navigate the school system for my kids. I wouldn't know how to go to a doctor or pay my taxes. I can't do any of that stuff. This is my country. And so I've been thinking a lot lately about what it means to be an outsider in your own country, what it means not to be accepted in a place where you call home. Now, this is a conversation that African Americans have been having for a long time. So I've been spending some time, as I've been thinking about my own Asian identity, reading about black history and the history of black activism, which is so inspirational, from abolition to the civil rights movement to Black Lives Matter now. But what I want to talk about today is how this experience is not just the Asian experience, it's not just the black experience, it has been the experience of the people of God all throughout Scripture. And we can learn from Scripture what it's like to be in exile, what it's like to be colonized, what it's like to be treated as an outsider where you're stuck, and what it means to resist when you're in that situation. So today I want to spend some time talking about the most prominent instance of exile in the Bible. That is when the Israelites are in captivity in Babylon. I want to spend some time reflecting on what it means to resist unjust systems and unjust rulers in those kinds of situations. And the place I want to go is Daniel. I've talked a little about Daniel before. Daniel, as I've said, is not just a book of children's stories with, pictures of, lions and Daniel in the lion den. You put that in the children's book because it's an easy picture to draw, and children like animals. But that, as you grow up and you start to realize, you're not just reading picture books, you're trying to understand what is actually going on in Daniel. It's not just about pictures of lions. It's a picture of life under colonial rule, which is actually quite dark, which is quite scary, which is very oppressive. Unlike many other books in the Bible, Daniel does not take place in Israel. It doesn't take place in Jerusalem. It doesn't take place at home. It takes place in Babylon, which has destroyed Jerusalem and brought the Israelites from Jerusalem over to another land and exiled, especially the leading citizens of that city. Daniel and his friends are not in their home native environment. They're in a foreign land, a place they'd never seen before, a place where they don't know the language, a place they were brought as captives, a place they were brought against their will, a place they were brought in chains. Then the whole book of Daniel is about what does faithfulness and survival and resistance mean in a situation like that? What does it mean to be a faithful Israelite in Babylon? What challenges and decisions do you have to make for your own survival? Where do you find hope and strength when you're politically outmatched and you have no power or legal recourse to resist the people who are in charge. Those are the kinds of decisions Daniel's friends face in our passage for today. Nebuchadnezzar has issued an order commanding them to worship a false god, and they have to decide how are they going to resist. And that's what I want to talk with you today about. I'm going to look at 3 points of how they handle this situation: defiance, discernment, and dependence. Defiance, discernment, and dependence, 3 Ds. By the way, this is the first time I've ever used a PowerPoint in a sermon anywhere. Anytime I speak anywhere, here, anywhere else, people say, do you need a PowerPoint? I always say no, because I just always thought it'd be too much trouble. I didn't want to coordinate the images with my talk, and I felt like, I'm just going to feel stressed out and not know how to click and speak at the same time. But Jeanette said I talk too fast in my sermons, and that I'm always bouncing from Bible passages to Bible passages. People can't flip through the pages enough. So in obedience to my wife and out of my love for this community, I'm using PowerPoint for the first time. We'll see how this goes. But this is my first time ever touching this clicker. All right, so let's talk about defiance. And let's go to the beginning of Daniel chapter 3 to see where the story starts. Chapter 3, verse 1 says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So King Nebuchadnezzar is setting up this giant image of gold, maybe gold-plated, maybe actually made of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. All right, so a cubit, I think I've shared this before, a cubit is a length from the end of your middle finger, your longest finger, to your elbow. So it's about 1.5 feet, okay? So you multiply that by 1.5 feet. It's 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. 60 cubits is 90 feet high, 6 cubits wide is 9 feet wide. That's about the height of a 9-story building. It's enormous. I was looking around, I did a Google search when I was writing this message, and I said, what is about 100 feet high? And here's one of the things that came up. Where is this? There we go. This LeBron James billboard in Cleveland, remember when he came back to the Cavs? You can see at the bottom of the image, there's this bus. That's how big, this is about 100 feet high. This is about 10 stories. This is about how big that image that Nebuchadnezzar set up would have been. And it's not just, paint on a wall, right? It's a statue. It's a physically imposing structure. And it's not just a picture of a basketball player. It's a picture of a god. It might be a picture of Nebuchadnezzar. We're not really sure exactly what it was. And it's something that you have to bow down before. You fall down before and you worship. And so you imagine this would have taken, months and months and so much money just to construct. They probably had to do an extra tax, to get the money for all the construction and all the materials and so forth. And finally, when it's all done, you get to the next verse, you have the dedication ceremony. Nebuchadnezzar summons, to his capital city, the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the advisors and the treasurers and the judges, the magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. And he keeps repeating all the officials who are in that room, all the brass, right? It's like the grand opening of a giant new building in Chicago, and they would bring out the mayor. They would bring out the city council members. They would bring out the aldermen. All the biggest names would be out there. It would be all the luminaries, maybe even like state senators or the governor or something like this. All the reporters, all the camera, all the media. It's a giant, giant event. And it's there that they announce how this statue is going to be used. Verses 4 through 6. Then the herald loudly proclaims, nations and peoples of every nation, of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of instruments, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. So here's the rule. At various points during the year, for sacred assemblies and so forth, for political gatherings, everyone throughout Babylon is going to get together. And when they hear the sound of these instruments, They have to bow down and worship that image. This is a requirement for everybody living in the land, not just for native Babylonians, but for all nations, for all peoples of any language, including the Israelites. And if you don't participate, there's a punishment. You are thrown into a blazing furnace. What Nebuchadnezzar is doing here is combining church and state. This is a very common strategy for authoritarian leaders, for dictators, and people who don't respect human rights. If your nation is associated with a certain religion, if your political community is associated with a religious community, then you impose religious conformity to secure political conformity. The main thing you care about is patriotism and loyalty to the state, but you get it through religious policies that promote your nation's religion and destroy other people's religions. And in order to do that, you have to make very effective and careful use of symbols and rituals and songs and anthems. Those become very, very important to combine religion and politics. If you don't honor those things, you are seen as a threat, as a traitor, as a revolutionary, as somebody who needs to be publicly disciplined. People get very, very sensitive when you don't respect national symbols. Okay? And here what he's doing is he's combining a national symbol with a religious symbol. And just think for a second about the way that Colin Kaepernick was treated when he took a knee at the national anthem. And this is a complicated analogy, I know, because it's not the same thing exactly. He's not protesting America's religious practices. But just think of the way that he was treated when he challenged a national symbol and ritual, the national anthem. People responded by saying he hates our country. He hates our freedoms. He's spitting on our soldiers and our military officials who protect our shores, who defend our borders. Why are you even in this country if you're not going to bow down that way? That's how the Jews would have been treated if they didn't bow down before Nebuchadnezzar. And this isn't just a football game. This is a very big political ceremony where there's a rule about bowing down, otherwise you get killed. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are themselves political officials, but they're foreigners who don't entirely belong there, who aren't treated as first-class citizens, who aren't treated the same way as Babylonians, and they are putting their lives at risk by refusing to bow down at this very, very public event. They knew that this was going to be a big deal. They knew that this was going to cause scandal. They knew that this would become known. They knew that this could cost them their lives. But they are faithful Israelites who believed that God had forbidden the worship of other gods. It was idolatry that the Israelites committed that led the Israelites to exile in the first place. God brought them to Babylon because they worshiped false gods, and they can't go to exile and worship false gods there now. And so they say no, and very predictably, some people start to protest them. They get very upset at them. These astrologers notice that they're not worshiping the statue, and they report the matter to the king. And Daniel 3:13 says, Nebuchadnezzar was furious with rage. You're spitting on me. You're spitting on this country. I made you an official of a province. I gave you privileges, and this is how you treat me? So he summons Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. He says, is this true you're not bowing down to this image that I spent so much money and raised all these taxes for, that I took months and months to prepare? You knew the rule. He says, if you do not worship at the appointed time, I will throw you into the fire to be burned to death. And that is when Daniel's friends defy Nebuchadnezzar. That's when you see their defiance. They say, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. Because if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. I'll treat you with respect, your majesty. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. I mean, just think about the calmness of that reply. They're not trying to cause a scene. They're not trying to make trouble. They're not trying to undermine Babylon as an empire. They're not trying to usurp Nebuchadnezzar or start some kind of violent revolution. They know that they're there. They're just stuck. But if Nebuchadnezzar wants them to worship an idol, well, we respectfully decline. And we don't have any need to defend ourselves before you on this matter. It does not matter if you are a king. It does not matter what authority you have over us. You are still just a man, and no man can force me to violate my conscience or my dignity. If Nebuchadnezzar wants to throw them into the fire, so be it, because God can deliver us. But even if he chooses not to, for whatever reason, I would still rather die than worship your God, so have at it, do what you want. There are times when wickedness and injustice must be confronted directly, when you have to speak truth to power. There are times when those who have authority are abusing it so flagrantly that you have no choice but to disobey and to challenge that moral wrong. And we see examples of this in Scripture time after time. We see it when Moses stands before Pharaoh and demands that Pharaoh let the people go, otherwise he'll bring plague upon plague upon plague upon their land. We see it when Jesus storms the temple and he denounces the Jewish leadership for making his father's house a den of robbers, and he begins overturning the tables and the benches and the money changers and those who are selling doves. We see it when the Jewish leadership tells the disciples in Acts chapter 5 to stop preaching the gospel. And they say, preach the gospel. Stop preaching the gospel. We must obey God rather than human beings. I'm sorry. You're going to have to go somewhere else if you think we're going to listen to you above God. And this is actually what is happening right now, as so many people have been taking to the streets to protest the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and all the other incidents of police brutality against black lives that we have seen over the many years. In an earlier sermon, Coach mentioned Ibram Kendi, who wrote this best-selling book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And he actually says, this may be the largest anti-racist mobilization in American history. And his work is on the history of anti-racism in this country. I was recently reading an interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote this very famous article called The Case for Reparations. It's actually about North Lawndale, and he's spoken before at North Lawndale College Prep. His dad was a Black Panther, was very involved with the Black Power movement. He was about 22 years old when King was assassinated in 1968. And Coates talks to his dad and said, what's this like compared to 1968? And his dad actually said, this is way bigger. This is way bigger. 1968, by the way, anybody who's listening to this, lived through the civil rights movement, I will listen to you for hours and hours. Tell me what that was like and how it compares to now. That just tickles my heart. I just like to read and learn all the time, so just tell me your stories. This is an open invitation to anybody. I will listen to you for hours. He said, civil rights movement, 1960s, it was largely in the South in these local places, right? It was like Birmingham specifically or Selma specifically. This is the whole nation. All around the country, northern cities, southern cities, you're seeing all sorts of different races come out. Ta-Nehisi Coates, his writings on race tend to be very pessimistic. You tend to come out of it and you feel very dark and sad. But he's in this interview, and he says, man, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I see hope. I see progress now at this moment. The NBA has resumed games right now. I just want you to contrast these two pictures of 2016 versus 2020. 2016, Colin Kaepernick took the knee alone and got so much controversy, he made the front page, the cover story of Time magazine, and he pretty much got blacklisted from the NFL and hasn't played since. Now, 2020, the NBA has started. They got Black Lives Matter written on the game floor. The entire team, both sides, both teams are on their knees. They are wearing Black Lives Matter t-shirts. It's the coaches, it's the players, it's the staff. It's a different moment even from 3-4 years ago when Colin Kaepernick was doing this. I got to mention this one because it's so deeply personal to me. There was an Asian American Christian march for Black Lives and Dignity at the end of June. And I've talked to some scholars about this, some historians of Asian American history. They said this is pretty much the first time this has ever happened. Asian American Christians are so new to this country, they don't have a history of protests or marches. They're just developing a racial awareness of themselves and of other racial groups. For the first time, there was a march by Asian American Christians for Black Lives and Dignity. It went from Chinatown, Chinese Christian Union Church, to Progressive Baptist Church. Some of you might know Charlie Dates. It was his church. He was one of the co-sponsors. And we stopped there in Bridgeport, and you can see the picture on the right. That's how many people came out. It was probably over 1,000 people, and they came from all over Chicagoland. I saw these Asians I knew from like 15, 20 years ago. I had not seen since when I was going to Trinity. I went to Trinity before I went to my PhD in the early 2000s, and I saw like fellow seminarians I hadn't seen since like 2003, and they came out. It was so encouraging to see them out there. Seung Chan Ra was one of the speakers. He was our speaker, for our church a couple weeks ago. And there's a picture of Diana Collymore. You can't see her behind the mask, and that's also Carl Paulson, who's just playing the bass. Jeanette and the kids were out as well. Jeanette hates being in pictures, but she was there with the kids. Stuff is actually happening. And what's sweeping this nation now began with a handful of people taking a stand, maybe taking a knee, getting knocked down and standing up again, getting knocked down and standing up again, until finally people started to take notice and say, wait a second, this isn't right. Something is wrong here. Even when you think your actions are small and you don't think they could have any effect, you don't know what they might do. You don't know how they might inspire others. You don't know how it's setting the stage for bigger and better things to come. You don't know what the long-term effect of your action is going to be. Our job is not to know what God will do with our actions. Daniel's friends didn't know if God was going to deliver them or not. But they did know what was right and wrong, and they took a stand in defiance against wrongdoing. And that is also what we are called to do when we face injustices in our own day. Discernment, number 2. One of the interesting things about Daniel and his friends' experience in exile is that the relationship with their leaders was not only negative all the time. It wasn't only antagonistic and confrontational and us versus them. Daniel lived in exile for decades. At the beginning of the book, he's a young man. That's why he's chosen. He's young and handsome and strong, and so they give him, the Babylonian food and literature and so forth to be a leader. At the end of the book, he's an elderly man. He's a sage. And he's looking back on his life over the decades and saying, wow, a lot has changed for me. Just a few decades after the Israelites are taken into exile and Daniel has his experiences with his friends, Babylon will fall to another nation. It'll fall to the Persians. And they'll have new rulers and new kings. Sort of like you're working for a company and the company gets bought out. And you now have like a new CEO and new policies and new workplace environment, and you got to adjust. And then, even in that new company, you might have different leadership, different managers, different people who are in charge, and you keep having to adjust and be flexible to different styles of leadership. And some of them are good and some of them are bad, and they have different strengths and weaknesses. And even the same person can sometimes have ups and downs and be good and bad at this, in the same time. Over Daniel's lifetime, he and his friends have to make different kinds of decisions about how they're going to work together with whom. Sometimes the response is defiance. Sometimes it's cooperation. Sometimes they stand up against abuses of authority. Sometimes they serve the king and help him to rule more effectively. In chapter 3, which we looked at, we see defiance. Daniel's friends refuse to bow down before an idol. But in chapters 1 and 2, you actually see that Daniel and his friends are assisting the king in the interpretation of his dreams. Daniel 1 says that the king was talking with Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and they're using his Jewish names there, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He was talking to them. He found none equal to them. And so they entered the king's service, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which Nebuchadnezzar questioned them, he found them 10 times better than his own magicians or enchanters. He was working with them, and they were cooperating at that time. In Daniel 3, after, in our story, God will deliver Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the fire, and Nebuchadnezzar actually changes his mind. He changes his policy, so now it's not as bad. Then Nebuchadnezzar says, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and they are willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. So I decree that any people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Israel, Anyone who says anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they have to be cut in pieces. Their houses are going to be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. And then he promotes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to a higher position in Babylon. This abuse of authority changes his mind. In chapter 4, though, he becomes proud again. Nebuchadnezzar becomes proud again, and God has to humble him. Verse 33, chapter 4, says, immediately what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar after he became proud was fulfilled. He was driven away from people. He ate grass like an ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. So Nebuchadnezzar is actually driven insane for several years because of his pride as judgment by God against him. Sometimes he's good, sometimes he's bad, sometimes he's up, sometimes he's down. And Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel, they got to read the situation and figure out what is the best response in this situation. If they're not coming after us, we'll work with them. If they are coming after us, we have to stand up for ourselves. And it's very, very tricky. What it requires is discernment. What is discernment? Discernment means judgment. It means wisdom. It means making game time decisions. Who do I start? Who sits on the bench? It's the last 10 seconds of the game. Are we going to shoot or are we going to pass? Which way do we go? The times when you need discernment are when there aren't really clear rules for what you're supposed to do. If you're asked to worship an idol, it's very clear. You don't worship that idol. If you're asked to lie or cheat or steal, it's pretty clear that the answer is no. But not all situations are that clear-cut. And sometimes you have to analyze the situation, figure out what's going on, understand people's motivations, and then you have to make a judgment call. You have to exercise discernment on what to do, and the answer might not be the same in all situations. There are some incidents that are straight up racist and need to be called out on the spot. I think George Floyd was clearly an instance of that. But there are a lot of instances in polite company where you hear something and it's sort of like in this gray zone between, did they say that to me because I'm a person of color? Or is that just like a little cultural insensitivity? Or am I like misreading things? I don't quite know. There's this whole gray area that you can't quite understand what just happened. It's sort of between racism and cultural insensitivity. Like, how exactly do you read that? Is this a time where I should confront the person and say something? Is this one that I should sit out so that I have more credibility at a later instance that's clear? I don't want to burn on my capital right now. Is this a situation where the person really did not know better, and a little grace and understanding would actually go a long way? Sometimes the answer is confrontation and defiance. Sometimes it's patience and grace and prayer. And we're always getting this wrong. I can tell you a lot of stories about where I've gotten this wrong. I frequently have situations where I'll get these emails from students, and they're almost always male. And they are just rude or inappropriate or wrong-headed in some kind of way. And I discover it like 9 o'clock at night when I'm just about to go to bed. And my kindness is sort of low. Maybe Jeanette's already fallen asleep. And my instinct is to fire off some very sharp, critical response, and I will feel so righteous and justified in what I do. I'm like, oh man, I got to set this kid right. Look at this kid's attitude. This kid has a problem. If they go to the workplace environment like this, they're going to get gobbled up. I need to fix them now. They should thank me for this email I'm going to write them. Pretty much every time I've done that late at night, it's gone wrong. I've ended up hurting the student. They didn't know that what they did was inappropriate. It compromises my relationship with them as a professor, as a teacher, as a mentor in the classroom. I just always feel like this tension around them. So I've just set this rule that I cannot send those kinds of emails until the next morning when Jeanette proofreads it. And usually, next morning when I wake up, I don't feel as angry. And then Jeanette will delete a couple of sentences and it still says sort of the same thing. It's just not quite so nasty and barbed. There's times when the best response is to be gentle and patient, but you react too harshly. But there's also times where I've been in the classroom as a professor and a student has made inappropriate comments and I didn't speak up when I should have. And students have come up to me later and said, you know what, I'm sort of upset that you didn't say anything. I'm like, at that moment, it just happened so fast. I didn't react quick, or I was too tired, or I just didn't want to cause trouble, or I was too scared or nervous. I mean, there's all these excuses that I could make, but I didn't step up to the plate and stand up to something when there was somebody vulnerable in that room. There are different kinds of situations that deserve different kinds of responses. Sometimes we speak up, sometimes we show grace. And we tend to be too harsh when we need to be gentle. We tend to be soft when we need to be firm. Sometimes we confront things that we could let go, and we're actually acting in stubbornness and pride. Sometimes we don't confront things that we should, and we might be letting other people down who need our support. In these kinds of situations, we need discretion. We need discernment. We need to make the right judgment call. So how do we react in exile when we're facing difficult situations? Yes, defiance is the right response, but you also need to exercise discernment and know when to defy and when to build up capital and wait for the right moment. Last point, dependence. One of the things I like about the book of Daniel is that the book is not just about Daniel. So much of it is also about his friends. And his friends are so familiar to us, we know their stories, that even though these are Babylonian names that would otherwise, maybe sound funny to us, we all know them because they're in all the children's stories. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Now, sometimes in the Bible, you have that lone authority who has to stand up, that lone individual who has to stand up and against authority. But in this case, in our story, it's three friends who are going to face off against Nebuchadnezzar together. And this is, again, a very scary decision, and it might be the kind of thing where they wouldn't have had the courage to do it on their own. I picture them talking through this situation together. I picture them trying to figure out what to do in a private room, whether they should openly protest the rule, what to say or do if they get caught. I picture them praying together and supporting one another and saying to each other, we're in this together, we commit to each other. And even as they head to the blazing furnace where they expect to die, they at least take comfort that they're going to die together. When we're going through trial, we can't face it on our own. We need the support of others. We need to depend on others. That's why I've been so thankful over the last months for Zoom, because there's been a very difficult time with the pandemic, with the police brutality, with the Asian stuff, with stuff that's been going on in many of our workplace environments and the economy. How do you go through stuff like that without friends and fellowship? I'm thankful for my Sunday school, which has continued to meet every Sunday. I'm thankful for Kingdom Men. I've got a group of college friends, Asian college friends. We've been talking about the Asian stuff together. And they help me to feel like I'm not going through this alone. I've got people to pick me up when I'm feeling tired and discouraged. We're all lonely. We're all isolated. We're all scared of getting the coronavirus. I've learned during this time to depend not on myself, but on other people. But of course, there's this story. There's one other figure who appears that also is someone that we can depend on. And this is where we're going to end. I just want to take you to this one strange passage here. In Daniel 3, 24, 25, when Daniel's friends are in the fire, King Nebuchadnezzar is looking at them through some kind of window. He's got some way to look into the blazing furnace. And he leaps to his feet in amazement, and he asks his advisor, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? And they replied, yes, your majesty. Yeah, there's 3 guys, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in that fire, unbound and unharmed. And that 4th man looks like a son of the gods. This is a very interesting and important detail. Nebuchadnezzar only threw 3 people into the fire. He had them bound up in chains and so that they couldn't move. And he turned up the fire so hot that even the soldiers who were bringing them into the fire got burnt up. Then he looks in the fire, he's waiting to see the 3 men die, and he sees another guy in there. He says, who the heck is that? There's this mysterious figure walking around, and all 4 of them together are unbound, they're not in chains, and they're totally fine. What you discover as you read through the Old Testament is that this mysterious figure appears in a lot of funny places and appears at times of great spiritual importance. When Jacob, Genesis 32, is preparing to meet his brother Esau, there's a mysterious man who appears to him in the middle of the night and wrestles with him and touches his hip so that he gets a limp. And Jacob will not let go until that man blesses him. And finally, the man blesses him and says, "From now on, you are no longer Jacob. I will call you Israel, because you have wrestled with God." In Joshua 5, this story is a little bit less known. Joshua is preparing to go to war. He's preparing to go into the land of Canaan, and this mysterious man appears before him. And Joshua, he's near Jericho. He looks up, he sees this man, and he says, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" And the man says, "Neither. Don't try to put me on one side or the other of your human conflict. I am the commander of the army of the Lord. It is as the commander of the army of the Lord I have now come." And Joshua falls face down to the ground in reverence and says, "You are the Lord. What message do you have for me?" In Daniel 4, you've got this mysterious man appear again, and he's liberating the three friends, and he's protecting them as they walk through the fire. And Christians throughout the ages have always understood this as a picture of Jesus Christ, as God who comes to his servants at those special moments of spiritual testing. And God comes in this mysterious figure to protect them and to strengthen them and to encourage them to press on. God understands sometimes the world is too much for us. There's too much injustice. There's too much to protest, and we can be overwhelmed. But just when the fires seem to be getting too hot, that's when Jesus steps around us and keeps us from getting consumed. Just when we think the waters will overwhelm us and we're going to drown, that's when Jesus lifts us up out of the waves and puts us on firm ground. When we feel scared and anxious, Jesus arrives and he becomes our comforter and he allays our fears. The burden of resisting injustice in exile is not ours to bear alone. We can depend on each other, and we can ultimately depend on Jesus. So as we think about our identity as Christians, as minorities, as those who live in injustice, let us defy that injustice. Let us do so with discretion and discernment, and let us do so in dependence on one another and on Jesus Christ, who is our champion and our advocate in our time of need. Amen.
Thank you for watching the sermons on Lawndale Community Church. Be sure to like and subscribe to Lawndale Community Church. And then also for more videos, just click on it. You will not be disappointed. And again, thank you so much for your support.